Rose windows aren't as common in England, but here's a lovely one from York Minster, with the effect of a lace doily. How glorious. And here's another from Lincoln Cathedral. And this one, not in a church, but in the Bishop of Winchester's palace in London, a marvellous Star of David design with precisely carved cusping, dating from about 1300. Unfortunately, we've lost the great rose windows of London. Old St Paul's had a fine rose, as you can see in this engraving. It looks almost Islamic in style, but that disappeared in the Great Fire of London. And the rose windows at Westminster Abbey were replaced in the 18th century, so they're not original. In Germany and in the Low Countries, the rose becomes a form that's often used in the gables of houses, often unglazed, like here in Tangermünde and here in Brugge. And it's also used in churches, just as it is in France. Here at Saint Laurent's in Nuremberg, a wonderfully spiky window that looks like a giant snowflake. Here's a lovely rose from Spain, one of the churches built by Ferdinand III in Cordoba. You can see how, like the Italian versions that we saw earlier, though, it's not as complex as the French roses, but concentrates on setting up a repetitive pattern of arcades. So far we've seen fairly simple designs that could have been designed with a pair of compasses. All the curves are simple and the roses move outwards in radiating rings of different shapes. But as the flamboyant style evolves, we see the curves getting more complex and the designs getting more adventurous. Here's the gorgeous rose at the Sainte-Chapelle I mentioned earlier. Instead of the rather static designs of earlier Gothic, everything here seems to be flowing. Let's put the date in context. This rose was made in 1485, the beginning of Tudor rule in England, 7 years before Columbus's trip to America, and nearly a century into the Renaissance if you were an Italian rather than a Gothic French architect. Here's Amiens, the South Rose, about 1500, and Beauvais, a very fine rose by Martin de Chambige. Look at the flame-like, sinuous forms of the tracery. Let's look at a couple of rather different windows. This rose window is very, very unusual. Instead of the centralised rose window design that you usually see growing out from the centre, it's based on two big petals or leaf-like panels which divide the whole window right down the middle. It's at Lincoln, and it's opposite another rose window, and they're called the Dean's Eye and the Bishop's Eye. Oh, another interesting oddity here at Bourges in the centre of France, about 1390. It's kind of a rose window, but not as we know it. It's a sort of rounded lozenge. Weird. And I think rather ugly, really. So now for a real favourite of mine. This is at Salamanca, in the new cathedral there. And it's a plain, completely open circle. We've returned with that to the simplicity of the Romanesque window. But in true Plateresque Spanish style, the stonework is beautifully ornamented. And with the end of the Gothic age, you might think the rose window had come to an end, but no. Here we are in Rome with a real Renaissance facade, Sant'Agostino, and the oculus is almost the only feature in this very plain building. So why did the Gothic age have this fascination with the rose? Well, one reason is that the circle is a perfect form. It's got no corners, no beginning and no end. So, for the medieval artist, it symbolised the perfection of God's creation. And the circle continued to fascinate Renaissance artists. Here's the Pazzi Chapel in Florence, where almost every element of the architecture is created by circles. Here in Orvieto Cathedral in Italy, the circle's been placed within a square, symbolising the relation of the finite and the infinite, time and eternity. And perhaps it also symbolises the incarnation, God made man. In the middle is the head of Jesus, and around the edge there are 52 heads, representing the weeks of the year. But I think another reason that the rose window became such a characteristic form of the Gothic is that it uses the same techniques of design and construction that we used in vaults and arches. Everything can be designed with a pair of compasses. And if you look at most rose windows, you'll find that they're all constructed implicitly in the same way Orvieto is. a series of squares within circles and circles within squares. The symbolism of light is important in Gothic architecture right from the beginning. The Gothic stained glass window is seen as a symbol of God's divine illumination, and the rose window in particular. Pure form is also important for an age which believed in mathematics and geometry as the basis of the universe. The Middle Ages saw God in many ways as a great architect or geometer, creating the universe with his pair of compasses. So the rose window is not just a pretty thing, it meant something. In A Life of St Hugh of Lincoln, the biographer tells us of the two great rose windows in the cathedral. They are great in themselves, but signify greater things still. So when you see a rose window, you may marvel at its beauty, but remember that to the medieval mason, it was so much more than just a beautiful ornament. It represented the whole universe compressed into a single window.